this session at 2 o'clock, and I'm going to read it as it's come through to me. It's about understanding gender, gender identity, and gender expression. If this is not your interpretation of what you were joining for, then please do stay. But as long as you're aware, this is what we're going to be talking about for the next hour.
Good.
Okay, so I'm going to hand you over to Stevie. There's still people coming in the room, so just bear with us a moment or so, Stevie. For those who've just joined, could I please ask for cameras and for microphones to be switched off? The session will be recorded, of course, and that does mean that if your camera is on, you will go viral. And so, in the interest of an effective recording, we will prefer to see Stevie only at this point. Yeah. So I'm going to switch off my camera and my microphone, and over to you, Stevie, for a quick introduction, if you can, while you're here, and then we'll pose questions later. But thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Carla, for the introduction. So yeah, as Carla said, my name is Stevie and I work for Black Country Healthcare NHS. I'm the LGBTQ+ community development worker for the Trust. So there's two parts to my role, really. There's the community element, so making sure that the LGBTQ+ community are accessing the support that they require in the community, making sure that any gaps in healthcare for the LGBTQ+ community are bridged, and see what I can do in regards to that. And the other half of my role is more internal, so making sure that us as a trust, so Black Country Healthcare as a trust, is as inclusive as it can be in regards to policy-wise, regulation-wise, how we treat our patients and how we treat our staff as well. So that's a bit of a background about what I do. So today's session, it's only a 20-minute session, so I'll try and cover as much as I can. It's mostly going to be a chat and a talk. I've got a few slides and a few kind of resources that I want to share with you guys as well. So as Carla said, it's about gender, gender identity, and gender expression. Now, if you have any questions while I'm doing the presentation, please put your hand up and I can get to them. I want this to be as interactive as possible, really, because I want to know what you guys know already and kind of where you're lacking in knowledge when it comes to gender. So kicking off first and foremost, a lot of people seem to think that there isn't a difference between how someone genders themselves and how someone expresses their gender and how someone would like to identify their gender. So I know this is a subject that can be quite confusing to some, but I'll try and break it down as basic as possible. And there's a resource that I want to show you first and foremost. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Hang on.
Yeah, fantastic. We can see that, Stevie.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you.
So this is something that I want to share with you guys, and this is a broken down version of what gender is and how gender identity and gender expression can make someone up. If anyone works in this field already or have worked in this field, then you probably have come across this resource. I like to use it because it does break things down in a way that people can understand. So this is a resource called The Genderbread Person. Okay, and as you can see, it's the little gingerbread figure, and different sections of the body are highlighted. So as you can see, you've got the brain highlighted, which is your identity, your heart highlighted, which is your attraction, your sexual organ area is highlighted under sex, and then this kind of dotted line going around the genderbread person is your expression. So I'm going to scroll down and kind of break down these these areas for you. So the brain shows gender identity. So this is how someone would like to be gendered. So that is kind of whether you identify as female, identify as male. That is how you would like to be gendered. That is how you fill in forms, you tick box male, female. But also you have the option of kind of are you non-binary? So non-binary means that you don't identify as either male or female. It's almost a spectrum. So where do you fall on that spectrum? How do you identify yourself? The gender expression element has nothing to do with the gender that you identify as. So the way you express your gender is kind of the clothes that you wear, you know, your mannerisms, the way you act, you know, what you do as hobbies, you know, that kind of thing. That is how you express your gender. Now, a lot of people think that, you know, if you identify as male, then you must like football, you must like getting your hands dirty, you must like doing construction, you know, very kind of toxic masculinity traits. And the same goes as female. If you identify as female, you're kind of meant to like pink and feminine things and princesses and, you know, very girly. You know, those are the stereotypical expressions that you know, male and females have. But that's not always the case. You know, you can be a cis straight male. So if you guys don't know, cis is what we call cisgendered. So that is kind of people who identify as the gender that they were born as. So if you were born male and you still identify as male, then you will be a cis male. So anyway, so expression is fluid, especially these more kind of present days. So you know, men will wear nail varnish, you know, paint their nails. Men will have longer hair. Men will wear more feminine items. And I have kind of got a few pictures here just to show you kind of. So these are a bunch of celebs. I mean, we all love celebs, don't we? Of kind of people who challenge the basis of gender expression and kind of they don't conform to men must wear jeans and trousers and women must wear blouses and skirts and dresses. You know, that's not how people live their life anymore. So if we look at these pictures here, so we've got Jaden Smith in the top left. He's very fluid with his fashion. He wears dresses, he wears skirts. This was actually, I think this was a Vogue shoot that he did, and you know the population were outraged and everyone just like threw their arms up in uproar saying a man can't wear this, blah blah blah. We've got Diane Keaton, who was an actress, and very often she's turned up at award ceremonies in tuxedos and suits and you know, almost power suit type of things, and you know, where very much so people who go to these award ceremonies, especially on the red carpet, are in ball gowns and looking very glamorous. I mean, I think she looks fantastic. But she's done that for quite a while. That's the reason why I got her picture. And coming up to more recent days, Harry Styles. Harry Styles has always kind of challenged the way people see him. So for instance at the Met Gala, he wore this amazing costume, corset, blouse, you know, something that is very out of the ordinary. Janelle Monáe, singer, wears tuxedos, suits, trousers, and then my icon Prince in the middle, who I absolutely love. Probably one of the very early people who started challenging those stereotypes, started challenging kind of what men and women can wear. You know, he'd very often go on stage in, you know, frilly, lacy blouses and tight trousers, and kind of being a straight man, he was kind of judged for it, but also being a person of color, he was judged for it as well. And then at the very end, you've got Ruby Rose, who we all know. And again, she's the same. She wears suits and stuff. So all of these are examples of gender expression. So just because you might identify as a cis straight guy doesn't mean that you can't, you know, like feminine things. It doesn't mean that you can't. It doesn't mean that you have to like football and all these kind of rugged stuff that stereotypically and historically men have liked. And then we go to anatomical sex. So that is kind of the highlighted area in the middle of the genderbread person. And that is the organs that you were born with. So of your genitals, so vagina, penis, and then you also have intersex, which if you're not well known or well versed, intersex is now what we used to call hermaphrodite. Very politically incorrect statement to call somebody a hermaphrodite nowadays. So intersex is what we call that now. And then it's very important as well to explain the difference between sexuality and gender. A lot of people think that if you are flamboyantly dressed, or if you are dressed as a female that is more masculine, then you must be a lesbian, or you must be a gay man if you wear, flamboyant things as well. But that's not the case, and that's all around gender expression. The difference between sexuality and gender is, and I like to say this, it's a little bit crude, but I like to use this example. So gender is who you decide to go to bed as, and sexuality is who you decide to go to bed with. I always use that analogy. Some people think it's crude, but I find that gets the point across really well. So sexuality is who you're attracted to. So whether you're a man attracted to other men, if you're a woman attracted to both women and men, that is what sexuality is. So very different to gender and gender expression. Now what I wanted to do was head over to this slide. So, I mean, I'm not sure what kind of knowledge everybody has here at the moment, but I thought I'd put this slide in just to kind of go over the terms of the different kind of terms that come under the gender umbrella under LGBTQ+. So, transgender. So we've all heard of transgender, but to just break it down, it's an umbrella term where sex, gender expression, and gender identity do not match up to the sex that you were born as. Gender fluid, gender identity changes or fluctuates. So remember I mentioned earlier that people look at gender as a spectrum. So it's not just male and female, there's a spectrum. And people can decide where they fall on that spectrum. So someone can wake up one morning and feel more masculine, and then other days they feel more feminine. So that's what gender fluid is. Non-binary, so gender outside the male-female binary, exactly the same as what I just mentioned. So again, on the binary, on the scale, people who don't identify as either male or female. That's what non-binary means. Agender, now this is a fairly new term. I mean, all of these terms have been around for years and probably since the beginning of time, but we have to remember that these terms are just coming out now and there's names for things. You know, one of the things that I hate is social media for this kind of stuff. So a post will come up about a transgender person or an agender person, and people will comment on and be like, oh, where have all these people come from? You know, we never had this back in my day. Well, you did. You did have this back in your day, and they've been around for a long time. But terms weren't made back then for these kind of terminology and what people identify as. So it's not the fact that people are converting or people are changing or people are different. They're the same people, but they just have a term for what they experience now. Gender neutral. Identity is not categorized as masculine or feminine, often a blend of the two. So I always use kind of androgyny for this description. So people who identify as both male or female, identifies both masculine and feminine. So that's kind of your shall we say, like Janelle Monáe has come out recently as gender neutral. So she will wear gender neutral clothing. She'll use they, them pronouns, and things like that. Genderqueer, umbrella term to describe non-normative genders like agender or gender fluid. So agender and gender fluid, what we've talked about, can be put under the umbrella term as genderqueer. And then, like I said before, pronouns, cisgender are people who identify as the gender that they were born as. Talk about pronouns. So pronouns has a big thing at the moment. They have a massive it's a massive talking point at the moment with companies. So I know, for instance, I love ASOS, so I get all of my clothes from ASOS. And ASOS have recently, when they're posting a model who are advertising their clothes for sale, then they'll put pronouns next to their name. So they'll tag their Instagram and they'll put she, her, he, him, they, them. And there was massive uproar when people first started doing that because people thought, well, why are you doing this? That there's no need. We can tell that it's a man, we can tell it's a woman, but sometimes you can't. You know, someone might look like the most feminine person ever and, you know, be girly, but they might use they, them pronouns. The one thing that we should never do, especially working in healthcare and especially working in the NHS, we should never assume someone's pronoun. So we should always ask, you know, whether it's a supportive role, whether it's face to face in patient ward areas, and even if it's, you know, internally with other staff, people should never assume people's gender or pronouns. And that all of that can be broken down by if you're working in the office, put your pronouns in your signature. You know, so people know how you identify. I know I do it. I know a few people in our trust do it. I did a big campaign over pronouns a few months ago, and it's really lovely to see so many people have taken that on board and put their pronouns in their email. But a simple question to a patient or a client who you're supporting of asking, how would you like them to be referred to? And they tell you, then you know. You know, then there's no kind of misjudging the situation or assuming, because we have to understand that there's a lot of people who, especially in the transgender community, who aren't easily passed as the gender that they would like to be known as. So we have to take that into consideration. So when we are face to face with a client or a patient, we have to ask them, it should be the new normal to ask them what they would like to be referred to as. And then that question's out the way. They'll either tell you he, him, she, her, they, them, or any other pronoun. That goes down on their record, that goes down on their account, and then any future meetings, you'll know how to address them. Terms to avoid in regards to gender and gender expression. So transgendered, not a very good term. Instead of saying, you know, oh, they're transgendered, or he's just come out as being transgendered. Just use, you know, transgender man, transgender female, however they would like to be referred to as. Again, ask that question. People are scared to ask that question. But if you flip it and you think from the patient or client's point of view, that might be the first time they've ever been asked that question. Throughout their life, that might be the first time they've ever been asked that question. And that might make their world. That might actually be, oh, well, this person is really interested in me. I love that they've asked me. So take that into consideration. Instead of being scared and, you know, hovering around the subject, just ask them when you first meet them. Just ask them. Biologically male or female. So these terms oversimplify a complex subject of what makes up someone's sex. Assigned female or assigned male at birth is preferred. I know there's a big hoo-ha at the moment. So Stonewall's been in the media, if anybody has been following that. And one of the things that people have been criticizing Stonewall for is, for instance, in work policies and in HR policies, a lot of the maternity and paternity policies and documents relate to mother or father. And people have taken a lot of different stances on this. People have thought it's it's in bad taste. You know, now that we have a more gender fluid nation, more gender neutral terms should be used. So in regards to, you know, saying mother, you know, someone, it would just be parent. And that's all it is, because we also have to think of, it's not just LGBTQ plus in that situation. It's people who can't have children who have adopted. It's people who foster children. You know, maternity and paternity isn't just for people who have either helped in procreating the child or given birth to the child. We have to really take that into consideration. And terms to avoid in regards to gender, especially transgender, is terms like tranny and shemale and it. So we know transvestite was a massive word back in the day. Shemale was used quite a lot as well. Those terms are quite archaic and quite dehumanizing to transgender people. So this is where it comes in, asking people what they would like to be referred to and as. So I think that is my 20 minutes up, but I'm happy to take any questions from anybody. I know that was a very, very general explanation, but happy to take any questions.
That was fantastic, Stevie. And interestingly, just as you said that towards the end about some of the terminology for transvestite, an audience member has stated that they belong to a group where people with a transsexual history don't like the words tranny or transgender. In fact, their best mate prefers to state that he is a man with a transsexual history. So that the importance there really is that you do have to ask.
Yeah.
And it's pleasant to ask, isn't it? We always generally ask somebody, how would you like to be called today? And, you know, particularly you say Stevie, but we wouldn't know because your title was Stephen.
Yeah.
So, you know, we said, what would you like us to call you today? So, you know, we do ask the questions already, but just not in the context that some people are maybe a little bit uncomfortable or just not sort of parfait with.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just to avoid any embarrassment and any awkwardness on both parts. If you simply ask, what would you like to be referred to as today? And then that kind of that breaks down that kind of barrier first and foremost.
Absolutely, the uncomfortable silences, etc. as well. Okay. Yeah. So there's no specific questions for you at the moment, Stevie.
I think someone has their hand up.
They do, yes. Well spotted. No, you're welcome.
Hello, it's
yes,
me that
absolutely.
Hello, my name's but it was me that actually put the comment about the transsexual, my colleague. I mean, a few weeks ago in the group, the subject came up and one of the members turned around and said tranny, and another person took such an offence to it, they actually nearly fell out. Because they don't like they're not exactly hot about the idea of transgender, but exactly on the line of what you said about transvestite, but they absolutely said they hated it with a passion. And the other person said, well, I don't, but didn't like the word transgender. And it just pointed out that even within us, with any community, you really do need to ask, and never to assume that even within your own community, everybody's going to be happy with terms, because they're not.
Yeah,
you know, it led to a discussion about the subject and what everybody preferred to be called.
Yeah.
And it's still the point that nobody still can't really get it right, no matter what you're dealing with.
Yeah,
I think it's absolutely correct. It's that it doesn't matter in terms of the identification of a single person. It's the pleasantry of asking, how would you like to be, or who would you like to be known as, how would you like to be identified as? It's just pleasant, isn't it, just to ask that question.
Yeah.
In essence of time, Stevie, we're going to show a short video from Finlay. Finlay wasn't able to make us live today, so he has sent us a video, and then we will come back to you, Stevie, in terms of any questions that the audience may wish to ask you live. So please do stay with us, and we will start the video by Finlay. Okay, so thank you, Finlay, virtually. Okay.
Mental health is something that's incredibly important to me. Mental health in general is really, really important to me, but I think men's mental health in particular is an area where there's still a lot of work to be done. So I'm really pleased to be here today talking about my experience with this. I'll tell you a little bit about me. My name is Finley Games. I am a transgender gay man, and I'm a YouTuber, blogger, author, speaker, and coach. And I share very openly about my own mental health journey and about my journey through gender transition, which definitely plays into my mental health. So I've had mental health challenges for as long as I can remember. From a very, very young age, I was extremely anxious, extremely low, and I had many, many interventions over the years to try and get to the bottom of why this was and to get the support I needed to be able to manage. But unfortunately, we could never get to the bottom of what was going on for me. And unfortunately, I then turned to using alcohol and drugs as a misguided attempt to self-medicate for how I felt, because it really was excruciating on a daily basis to just wake up and just feel this knot of anxiety and this deep hole of dread and despair. And I just needed a head holiday. And unfortunately, that head holiday lasted a number of years. So it wasn't until 2010 that I finally hit the right rock bottom for me to get well. And in recovery, as I was sober for the first time, I was able to really work through what had been going on for me all those years. And the combination of sobriety and the rising awareness of transgender people and people speaking openly about being trans led me to realize that I was in fact transgender, and that all of the issues I'd had growing up, the anxiety, the poor mental health in general, the depression, all of these things were actually due to undiagnosed gender dysphoria, because left undiagnosed, that complete distress of gender dysphoria just spirals into severe mental health problems, as they had for me. So once I realized I was transgender, this was great in some ways to know a reason why I'd felt how I did, but also it was so difficult to find this out because I was clean and sober. I was a year clean and sober at the time, doing really well for the first time, managing my life for the first time without drink and drugs. My mental health problems were still there. I was still hugely anxious, but I was responding to these issues differently and just living life very differently. And I worried that when I came out as trans, that people would look at me differently. There was a lot of stigma, there still is, a lot of stigma around being transgender. We face daily onslaught from the media and lots of other groups about being trans. And I didn't want that life. And I was scared. I was scared that people wouldn't want to know me and that I'd lose my family. But for me, the pain of staying the same far outweighed the fear of coming out. And I knew that if I didn't come out, I was going to go back drinking. And I doubted very much if I had a second recovery in me. And after many suicide attempts, I didn't think that I would manage if I denied the truth of what I'd found out. So I came out as transgender in early 2011, and then I started my gender transition. And it was incredible that as my gender transition progressed, my mental health issues got far less. And this is the incredible thing that a lot of people do not realize about going through gender transition, that this isn't a choice, this isn't a whim, this isn't something we decide. Going through transition, choosing hormones and surgeries are life-saving treatments. And they're life-saving because they end up solving our mental health problems. Less anxiety, less depression, less risk of harm. And the more I was feeling comfortable in myself, the more my mental health was getting better. And now I was 37 when I came out as trans. So I had a number of years with poor mental health. So of course that wasn't going to change overnight. But what did change dramatically was the way I was managing my mental health. And even today, I still have ongoing mental health issues, but again, I manage them differently. I think what was really tricky for me in terms of my mental health journey was, on the one hand, I had this wonderful experience of my body matching me for the first time through hormones and surgery. But I had new challenges arrive when it came to my mental health, because in early days of transition, when you're desperate to be seen as the man you are, in my case, you go above and beyond trying to show people your maleness. Now, before hormones, I didn't look like this. I didn't have a beard. I didn't have the low voice. So to everybody else, I looked female. And that experience of being misgendered is awful. That in itself causes feelings of being suicidal, mental health, anxiety, all of these things. And so I would do whatever I could to show my maleness, which included wearing very stereotypically male clothes, acting in very stereotypical male ways. And unfortunately, a very stereotypical male behavior is to hide emotions, to not speak about things that are often seen as more feminine, the softer side of life, experiencing emotions, talking about feelings. And I started to shut a lot of that down because I was afraid of not being seen as male enough by expressing these things. And as my transition progressed, I was finding this really difficult to manage. And alongside that, I came to realize that I was also gay. And I didn't want to be gay because all I wanted after a lifetime of being different, first identifying as a lesbian and then being an obvious trans man, I just wanted to be blended into the background and disappear. I had a lot of internalized homophobia and transphobia around being gay. But more than anything, gay men are often feminized. And for a trans person who is masculine, being feminized is absolutely soul destroying. So there was a lot going on around my masculinity that was actually causing a lot of upset, which was so hard because I was happier than I'd ever been in so many ways, with my body, face, everything changing, but struggling with this aspect of my identity that I'd started living as male, but was becoming somebody I didn't want to be. And this is actually the irony of early transition, that we often have to be somebody we're not in order to be seen as the person we are. And I did a lot of work on myself on this. And gradually, as I went through my transition and I started to own my own maleness and my own version of being a man, I started to finally let go of all this and realize that I could speak about my emotions. I could share in very open ways, and that didn't take away my masculinity. We are all human beings with emotions, feelings, fears, all of that. And there is so much emphasis in society on certain stereotypical roles that are so harmful. They're harmful for men and they're harmful for trans men. Sometimes I think in a bigger way, because masculinity affects every man. Every man wants to be seen as masculine enough, as male enough. And as trans people, this is so important when we identify as trans masculine. And this was getting in my own way. And so for me, it was a really important part to work through this idea of what masculinity is and realizing that I'm me. I spent too much of my life trying to be somebody I wasn't. The whole point of going through transition was to be my honest, authentic self. And my honest, authentic self is gay, is very naturally flamboyant, likes wearing pink, loves a fluffy unicorn. And I've learned to embrace those aspects of myself. And because of that, my mental health is so much better. Now, of course, I'm not saying that all men, in order to have good mental health, need to love unicorns, pink, and fluffy things. What I'm saying is it is about owning our masculinity, being so confident and assured of our masculine self that we can express ourselves in whatever way we need to feel comfortable and to stay mentally well. I really do think it would be a great idea if men's mental health thought about trans men more often, because I think as trans men, we get funneled into a gender pathway and anything we experience should be looked after by the gender specialist. But actually, a lot of the time, it's just general mental health stuff. And it hasn't helped me in the past to just have how I'm feeling funneled into being trans. A lot of it was just about being a man. And I would have liked to have been included in men's support, in talking about men's mental health generally, because that actually would have helped my masculinity and my belief in my masculinity grow as well, you know. So that is a very brief synopsis of my journey. It has really been twofold. It's been the surgeries, the hormones I've had that have helped improve my mental health, and a lot of deep work on what being a man means to me. I've written a really detailed memoir about my lower surgery, because for me, that was a big thing about owning my masculinity, was going through lower surgery and adapting to my changed body, but also to be a gay man. And in my book, I talk very openly about what it's like to go through the process of your body not matching your gender, and how that completely impacts and improves your mental health, your well-being, your quality of life when you go through surgery. I think it's really important to think about trans people, and it's so lovely to see a gender and sexuality element added when talking about men's mental health, because these things are often overlooked and they're so incredibly important. If you'd like to know more about me, I do have a website over on finleygames.com. You can find links to my books there and all my YouTube channels, content where I talk very openly like this. And I'm also very open to being asked any questions. I'm not very easily shocked. And I think it's really important to have conversations about mental health, because we need to reduce the stigma, but also around LGBT, especially trans issues. That conversations is how we learn, how we accept, and how we find out more about things that we might only have a one-sided view about. So I'm always open to be asked any questions. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for inviting me today. Take care.
And I'm sure the audience and our audience will agree, what a fantastic inspiration and a fantastic story. And so we've got our second live experience person with us today. So Alex, would you like to switch your camera on? We're there at last. So thank you to Stevie so far, and to Finley, and just as a reminder to the audience, Finley was virtual, so absolutely appreciate you might wish to ask questions individually and to Finley directly. We will put all the resources in the website. But over to you, Alex, and then we'll have a live chat with both yourself and Stevie.
Thank you, it's good to be here. I am going to try and share my screen, so fingers crossed. There we go, hopefully you can see that okay. So,
wonderful, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my experiences of healthcare, mainly as a trans and non-binary individual. My name is Alex Claire Young. I'm transmasculine, which means that I have transitioned towards male. But I'm also non-binary, which means that I also identify kind of out with the gender binary of male and female, not quite as male, but towards male. And I'll say more about that in a moment. I'm spending a lot of my time at the moment researching the lived experiences of trans people, particularly trans people of faith, and working on diversity, equity, and inclusion around LGBTQ+ identities, but also more generally, because there are a lot of important intersections. I am a minister in the United Reformed Church, and that is something that feeds into a lot of the work that I do, but that is also quite challenging from a diversity and inclusion perspective. And I'm happy to say more about that in questions if that is of interest to people. So my story so far, this is an image of a book that I've written. So if you want to know more about me, that's the way to find out a little bit more. But I guess my story starts when I was at school as a child and young person, and I really genuinely believed that I was an alien. I felt so different from everyone else that I had no reference points, and I felt completely alienated. I went to an all-girls school where clearly I didn't fit. I didn't have any friends at all, and I was constantly getting in trouble for being different. When I moved to secondary school, I moved to a mixed school that had boys too. And as soon as I was there, I realized just like that, well, I'm a boy. It just felt natural to me. But at that time, this was well over a decade ago, there was no trans visibility at all. And it didn't feel possible to say, I think I'm a boy. So I just kept it inside, and that contributed to some really serious mental health difficulties in my teenage years. I experienced a lot of bullying and exclusion, both at school and out in the world, including an attempt at conversion therapy, which was very difficult and led to me leaving the church for a period of time. But when I went to university, I met other trans people for the first time, and there was just this immediate sense of mirroring, this immediate sense of meeting someone and looking in the mirror and thinking, that's it. This is who I am. This all makes sense. And being able to join those dots and to start to transition. So I transitioned over a period of several years, both privately and through the NHS. But for me personally, I don't identify as a person with a trans history. I still identify as trans. And for me personally, transitioning is kind of a never-ending journey of self-discovery. Over time, I also came to understand that I was non-binary. Like our previous speaker, I experienced some of that pressure to conform to toxic masculinity. And for me, the way to respond to that personally was to move away slightly from identifying as male and to actually say, I can be who I am, whether that means that sometimes I'm going to want to wear nail varnish or that actually I do have a softer side. And also things that are beyond stereotypes, that are just about being who you are outside of gender, became very important to me. And I use the pronouns they, them mostly, although I do also use he, him. But for me, they, them is a way to express the fact that when someone's talking about me or to me, I'm a person who's about more than just gender. And finally, I'm not sure how well you'll be able to see that bottom one, but finally, when I talk about being trans, I like to talk about joy. We talk a lot, particularly in the health service, about things like dysphoria, which is the discomfort that trans people might experience, about needing to change bodies, about finding things really, really difficult. But for me and for many trans people today, a lot of our transition is motivated by joy. It's saying, where is that thing that just feels right for me? What are the things that I celebrate about being trans? Are there perhaps actually particular talents and gifts that I gain from my lived experience? In Christian contexts, people often say to me, but God doesn't make mistakes, or do you believe you were born in the wrong body? And my answer to both those questions is no, of course not. I believe that I am who I'm meant to be, that I'm not a mistake, and that I can live as who I am with joy. I have, however, experienced some difficulties in healthcare, which for some reason I've managed to spell as Heathcare on today's slide. But I've had some difficulties in healthcare, some of which are larger or more structural, so you might not personally be able to address, and others of which will come into personal practice, but all of which it really helps to be aware of when working with trans and non-binary clients. The first problem is the computer says no problem, which some of you may have experienced. A lot of the NHS's IT infrastructure is based on the assumption that everyone is either male or female. This means, for example, that to get a smear test, I had to write a handwritten letter to the head offices of the NHS because as someone who is registered as male, I couldn't get a smear test even though I had a cervix. So when computer systems don't match the lived realities of patients who are being helped, sometimes that can cause real difficulties and real problems that were just as frustrating for my GP as they were for me. Healthcare accessibility. A couple of years ago, I had really serious chest pains. It ended up being a sprain because I'd lifted something heavy, but I had these really serious pains. And in the end, my employer phoned an ambulance, and the ambulance crew came and they asked me questions about my transition for a good hour before they asked me any questions that were directly related to the pain that I had. Luckily, that pain was something minor, but if it had been something more serious, the fact that they were more focused on the fact that I was trans than the fact that I was having chest pain would have been difficult. A large percentage of trans and non-binary people avoid going to any healthcare services because they find that they're stigmatized or treated differently in ways that can be quite unhelpful. And remember, these are healthcare treatments that have nothing to do with trans. They're just the day-to-day healthcare that everyone needs, but they're harder to access for trans people. Debates. Often I find when I go to a GP surgery or a hospital, I get brought into certain debates about trans identities, and it can cause me a problem accessing treatment. One of my GPs once decided to debate with me whether I needed hormones and whether they had any medicinal benefit for me for over an hour, when appointments, as you know, are largely meant to be 5 minutes, before they would prescribe me hormones, despite the fact that I'd be being prescribed by previous GPs for almost a decade. I often end up in those sorts of debates. I also required a hysterectomy a couple of years ago for health-related reasons, but the consultant that I went to see decided that she needed to debate whether or not she should be doing gender-related surgery. It took several stern letters to persuade her that actually, as someone who had fibroids, I really seriously did need a hysterectomy, and it had nothing to do with being trans. And I want to mention transition-related healthcare. Trans gender identity clinics have massive waiting lists. They technically come under the label of mental health care, but the waiting lists far outlast the recommended waiting times. I know this is a sensitive topic at the moment as the NHS recovers from COVID, but it is really tricky that trans people often don't receive any support for years and years and can suffer from some of the mental health difficulties that we've just heard about while we're waiting. So there really is a need to prioritise our needs alongside everyone else's. And finally, training. Most of the medical professionals that I've spoken to haven't undertaken any trans training. I know that that is changing, but very slowly. And I want to say, if you work in a place where you can influence training and training needs, please do ask a trans person to come and train you on trans accessibility and do an audit of your practice to make sure that you're troubleshooting so that some of the things that I've spoken about today don't happen. Thank you.
Alex, powerful discussion there, presentation. Thank you so much for sharing. On the subject of training, could I invite Stevie back just to the front screen? It would be really useful to address, hi Stevie, to address a sort of a conversation that's happening in the chat box about training and education. And I know that there is a remit, if it hasn't already started, to offer awareness to those in school at particular ages. I think the conversation really is, what would be your guidance? And perhaps if we start with Stevie first, in terms of the terminology and how young adults at a particular age truly understand what this terminology means, to try and support them in their future identity. And Alex, perhaps you can come in at that point then. Over to you, Stevie.
Yeah, I think in regards to gender and, what we know about gender, I mean, they say that from as young as 2 years old, I think, then you can start to specify what gender is. So, mommy is a woman, daddy is a dad. It's not about putting this education in schools. It's about having this education from a young age. So by the time you get to school, you have some basic understanding of this. So I know, I mean, school can be tough anyway, especially for people who consider themselves to be a little bit different to everybody else. But in regards to kind of training, I think it's important that things like sex ed is inclusive. It's important that the kind of inclusivity element around being LGBTQ plus is taught in school. From personal experience, being a person of color and being a gay man, that never came into fruition. I mean, that was never taught to me that I can be both. It was always, you're either a person of color or you're a gay man. I suppose it's the same with Alex with religion, the intersectionality around religion and LGBTQ plus. I think if we're taught that someone can be Black, female, lesbian, and disabled all at the same time, how much harassment can that person take? They can get harassment from all different sides of the kind of spectrum in regards to that. So it's about not, because honestly, if I was in a classroom and they wheeled a TV in and they was like, right, we're going to watch a documentary about gay men now, I'll be like, oh my God, earth swallow me whole, I want to go home. It's about not shining light to it to segregate people, but bring that inclusivity element into the school, to show all sides of discrimination, not focusing on just the one, because I think that can estrange more people than helping them.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely agree. It has to be a whole holistic approach, doesn't it, to anybody who may identify as a difference in any, as you say, any spectrum. I guess really the question was, at what age do you think? I mean, I know you mentioned at the age of 2 that you know that these youngsters start to identify with mummy and daddy, or mummy and mummy, or daddy and daddy. You know, even to the point now where we're saying that's the first mummy and a second mummy, and a first grandma and a second grandma. At what age do you think that this education should be taken into schools so that we can support them from an age? Particularly, I mean, we've heard a lived experience from Alex. I mean, Alex, what's your thought on terms of the age, given that we do start to identify at a very young age? Oh, you've got your microphone muted.
It's a typical one, isn't it? I think partly, as Stevie says, it is about that more everyday thing. So, for example, every primary 1 classroom has a library. There are age-appropriate books about gender identity and sexuality from the very beginning of the curriculum. So it's entirely possible to kind of gently introduce that at any age. And I agree as well that intersectionality is really important in that. I do think, though, that we also do need trans role models physically in schools, because as a young person, I'd never met another trans person. And if I'd known that trans people existed from age 6 or so, I could have had a completely different life and not had the real difficulties that I have had.
Yeah. Okay, so that's interesting, isn't it? So I suppose our remit here today is about that awareness and education, and perhaps we do need to continue and sort of persevere with that education of awareness of the grown-ups, so that not only do the youngsters have some support and some person to talk to, they are also indirectly educating their youngsters, so that when they do get into the education system in that classroom, they're not embarrassed, and they're open to conversations, they're open to questions, but also have that internal support network, even within schools. We're getting there, I think, slowly and surely, aren't we, with the NHS, in terms of this is what LGBTQ plus means and look likes, and we're absolutely getting those support groups out there. We need to perhaps do it a little bit more of a push in terms of the education systems and mums, dads, and others. In terms of time, sadly, I know there's lots more people who are saying, oh, fantastic talk, and we really want to continue this. We've come to the end of session 3. If anybody would like to continue the conversation, then please do so up until sort of 3 p.m. I'm hoping Alex and Stevie will both stay with us to answer those questions. In the meantime, resources, as always, will be in the links. If anybody is struggling within their workplace, for example, with this education and awareness, then please do put something either in the chat box or with the website addresses that have been put in there throughout the day, and we will certainly try and address that education and awareness across the NHS. So Stevie, Alex, thank you from me. I'm going to move into the next session, which is around mental health and what is it for blokes particularly. So this is I guess a contentious title, Good Mental Health Will and Be for Blokes, but please do join us for that session, and I'll be back in touch with you, Steve and Alex, later. All right, but thank you, and please do stay and chat and network.